On the 25th of June 1900 at Frogmore House, he was given the name Dickie. Queen Victoria agreed to be his godmother and, as with all things, basically took over the whole christening event when he was just 3 weeks old. As the years rolled by, this man would become one of the royal family's most notable characters. His brilliance, decisiveness and hard work set him in a formidable light. We'll now take a look back from his early years towards a unique and extraordinary career, ending sadly with an untimed departure when he was assassinated in 1979. Join me now as we discover the brilliant and resilient story of Louis Mountbatten. And please like the video and consider subscribing for more historical stories. For the first 10 years of Dickie's life, he was educated by his mother, and by all accounts, she did an excellent job. He spent many hours with her while his father was away, and would even go on travels not really prescribed for such a youngster. But again, he excelled and was a very enthusiastic child wanting to learn more. Dickie would spend some time overseas with relations, usually with his mother's sister, Alex, who had married Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, who was also his father's first cousin. The Tsar was a simple, kind-hearted man who enjoyed nothing more than spending time at home with his children. The downside was he was a relatively weak and indecisive man who didn't fit his position as the absolute monarch. Travelling was undoubtedly a large part of Dickie's early life, yet by age 10 he was ready to move into proper schooling. He was set for a boarding school and arrived at Lockers Park in Hertfordshire. Dickie's mother continued to support him, but he would now start to grow and learn. This was his time. He attended intending to work, be honest and brave, and all these attributes would surface and test him later in life. Just 3 weeks before his 13th birthday, Dickie entered the Royal Naval College as a cadet. However, this new move wasn't all plain sailing. In these early years, he was troubled with sickness, bronchitis and whooping cough, but he came through and continued. By 1914, the world was set to change forever, and Dickie would now see for the first time the horrors of war. After passing out of Osborne in 1914, he went to the Royal Naval College, Dartmouth. He quickly excelled and climbed the ladder, yet just before his final exams he broke his leg, but still took the papers. However, he was upset at only being 18th out of a class of 80. In his final 3 months, he once again intensified his learning, this time finishing first. His first posting would be on the Lion, under the leadership of Sir David Beatty. Admiral Beatty was Dickie's hero, but life for a young midshipman was difficult, with Dickie saying he didn't think times had moved on much since the days of Nelson. The work was hard, and after all, coal was the primary fuel source for such mighty craft. It could take as long as 10 to 12 hours to get them sea-ready. In 1917, the Battenberg family lost their family name and their German titles. Hysteria was reaching new heights, and the government advised George V that members of the royal family should take British names. The King's family was renamed the Windsors, and Queen Mary changed from Tech to Cambridge. As for Dickie, his name also changed to the one we know now, Mountbatten. Throughout the end of 1917 and into 1918, European families, especially the connections with Russia, made desperate attempts to find out what was happening. A Russian revolution had already taken place, but by 1918, on the 2nd of September, news came through that revolutionary forces had assassinated the whole of Nicholas II's family. The young Tsarevich, just 14, was shot 4 times, and Anastasia, the youngest of the girls, had been bayoneted 18 times. In November 1918, the war ended, but the world was now a very different place. Mountbatten, now 18, had served and continued his training over the last 5 years. The foundation now laid for a career in the Navy. But first he needed some time to relax. A change of scenery was the order of the day, but Dickie was soon back to doing what he now did best. You see, Dickie had always been on excellent terms with Edward, Prince of Wales, known in the family as David, and so close was this friendship that in 1920 he was invited to go on tour with the Prince to Australia, New Zealand and the West Indies. Dickie looked forward to this as he could only see a way to improve relations and discover these places he had fought hard for and defended. Dickie kept a diary throughout the tour and the two men became closer. Edward would say sometimes he wished they could swap roles, as the responsibilities weighed too heavily upon him. But the two men continued their tour, but tragedy struck on July the 5th, 1920, when on board a train at 2:45 p.m, a series of violent jolts were felt. The train had derailed. Mountbatten jumped out and raced to the royal coach that was now lying on its side. Luckily, the prince was fine, although shaken up by the event, and he even joked by saying, "Well, at least we've done something that was not on the official programme." Yet had the train been travelling any faster, it would have been a certainty that fatalities would have occurred. After all the tour excitement, he took some leave and travelled to Dunrobin Castle to stay with the Duke and Duchess of Sutherland. At a large house party, he again bumped into Edwina Ashley, a lady he had met before. She was beautiful and had intelligent traits that attracted Dickie. But then Dickie received the heartbreaking news that his father had died. The Prince of Wales, who was also present at the party, knew he had to help. It was essential Dickie didn't dwell on this sorrowful moment. To strengthen his resolve and get him away, the Prince took him on a second tour, this time to the Far East. Japan, Burma and others were visited, but India was the real jewel in the British crown. Although Britain contributed to India, there was a growing demand for independence, something Britain gave much thought to, especially after the help from them during the First World War. When the Prince and Mountbatten arrived, demonstrations took place. Gandhi demanded that a peaceful boycott should take place, but the whole event backfired and the situation worsened, and Gandhi was placed in prison. But with all the upheaval, Mountbatten fell in love with India. He had made personal friends and became adept at playing polo. But his main reason was he had been writing to Edwina Ashley all through the tour, begging her to come out and see the beautiful landscapes. She did, and travelled on a one-way ticket. On St. Valentine's Day 1922, the couple danced and then sat out in her sitting room. Dickie proposed, and she said yes. Edwina Cynthia Ashley was born on the 28th of November 1901 and named after her godfather, King Edward VII. After the marriage announcement, Victoria, Dickie's mother, took Edwina to her heart. These two women were very similar, having strong personalities and an insatiable curiosity. The young couple, keen to be married, would seal the deal on the 18th of July 1922. It was the social event of the season. Naval officers formed a guard of honour and a gun crew of sailors drew the bridal car away from the church to a very extravagant but glittering reception at Brook House. In the days that followed, the couple would initially travel to Broadlands, the home of Edwina's father, but then within 6 months on half pay, Dickie and Edwina left for France and Spain, staying with his cousin Queen Ina and King Alfonso. But the biggest treat for the couple would be a trip to America. Upon arrival, they made a tremendous impact by meeting President Harding and other notable people. His first speech at a Navy League dinner proved quite an ordeal, he said, being just a young lieutenant. But then Hollywood beckoned as the film capital of the world, and some of the greatest names in this movie wonderland were on hand to meet them. Cecil B. DeMille, a prominent director of the day, and stars including Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks and Charlie Chaplin. Tours of the Grand Canyon only added to this trip of a lifetime for the newlyweds. It wasn't just film stars they met. When in New York, sports fans saw them side by side with the greatest baseball player of the time, Babe Ruth. It really was the stuff of dreams. But by December, it was time to sail home. In the roaring 20s, the Mountbattens were in full swing and belonged to society's smartest and most glamorous set. Dickie was even called a playboy, although it's claimed he was working harder than ever. By 1923, Dickie now began to once again return to his naval duties. He was ambitious but had to decide which branch of the Navy was the best fit for him and his skills. By 1934, his perfect fit was his HMS Daring. He was given command of one of the most modern destroyers in the Mediterranean fleet. His motto was daring by name and daring by nature. But little did he know that his then motto would be tested to the full in just a few short years. However, his dream ship didn't last long. He was taken away from it to be part of other craft. The glamour was fading, but Dickie remained upbeat. The following year, the Prince of Wales became King Edward VIII. Mountbatten's best friend now enjoyed a life of pompous protocol. Although loved by the public, the older generation with noble thoughts made them feel suspect. Edward's reign began brightly, but in 1936 the Prime Minister was faced with a dilemma, as Edward wanted to marry his mistress, Mrs. Wallis Simpson. On the 19th of December 1936, the King summoned his three brothers and Mountbatten to spend his last afternoon at Fort Belvedere. It would be on the 10th of December that he abdicated. The Duke of York now stepped up and became King George VI after being crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 12th of May 1937. At the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, it would bring everyone back to the ground with a bump. A new war unlike any other from before. New technologies now graced the field. Gone were the days of attrition and going over the top. Mountbatten commanded many ships, including HMS Kelly, until a German U-boat torpedoed her. Luckily, she survived, but after repairs was sunk by German bombers in 1941. On one mission, a man left his post. The penalty was death, but Mountbatten instead cautioned him. He told the ship's company, "I propose letting him off with a caution, or rather two cautions, one for him and the other for me, for having failed to impress myself sufficiently on you all over the last 3 months, for you know I would never tolerate such behaviour." Mountbatten was one of Winston Churchill's favourites. In 1941, Churchill asked him to become Admiral of the Fleet, replacing Lord Keyes. But Dickie responded, "Sir, I would rather be back at sea with my friends." But Churchill replied as only he could, "Have you no sense of glory? What can be achieved by expecting to be sunk in a bigger and more expensive ship?" As the war began to close, Mountbatten took stock of what had been achieved. His greatest moment was possibly receiving the Japanese surrender on the 12th of September 1945. And his rewards came thick and fast now. A rear admiral upon his return home, he was also made a Knight of the Garter, and by 1947 created the Earl of Mountbatten of Burma and Baron Romsey. Mountbatten, still only 46, wanted to return to the sea, but his next role was possibly one of the most difficult in his life, a task that would need patience and every last ounce of his leadership skills. Prime Minister at the time, Mr. Attlee, had sent for Mountbatten to succeed Lord Wavell as Viceroy of India. His task was to transfer power back to the Indian people. Mountbatten never wanted this job but knew he would have to tread very carefully to bring about a peaceful solution for all concerned. There had been much killing and rioting throughout the land in 1946, the year of the Great Calcutta killings, suggesting 6,000 were dead and 15,000 wounded. It had to stop, but the warring communities would take some convincing on the plans. Although India had split, the British government's recommendation was to grant their independence quickly, so they could sort the matters internally and outside of British rule. But Mountbatten knew this couldn't happen. The factions were split on many items, and the only reasonable way was by creating two independent nations, one India, and now the new one, Pakistan. On the 4th of June 1947, Mountbatten held a press conference, the most memorable one for the people of India. He stated his solution for two independent countries and insisted that the change would begin on the 15th of August. This remark staggered many who thought it would take months rather than weeks. Still, the date was set, and a complete transfer of powers would now be given to both dominions.